One of the things that I think we have to do in this world is take space. Coaching is a spiritual vocation, and we can interpret that in many ways. But one of the ways in which I think it is a spiritual vocation is it phones demanding our attention all of the time is problematic and is going to make us more distractible. And if we've got that tendency already,
You made a mistake there, but you said her.
I'm not going down there, Mark. I don't know about people being more fragile. I think what it does is it makes people a little bit less embodied when we're doing. If you want to work with people at a deeper level, you're going to have to include the body. And if you want to include the body, you're going to have to get to know your own body and build range.
Back on the show today, my old friend Aboodi Shabi. So Aboodi has a very strong background in coaching. He's been coaching for a lot longer than most people in the UK. I first met him through the Newfield Network. He now works for Henley, I believe, Henley Business School. So maybe you can tell us about that. So he's gone corporate now. He also has a background in yoga and different other practices. So Aboodi, welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Nice to be with you and see you again.
Bloody good to see you again. How's things at Henley?
Yeah, they're good. I work for Henley part-time, so I have 2 days a week at Henley, and the rest of the time is doing my own work, my own coaching practice. It's good. It's good.
When you're working with like a mainstream, business school, the Henleys, the Ashridges, those kind of things,
Hmm.
or a business client, how would you begin to explain the idea of embodied coaching?
Well, that's a really good question. And I suppose, in a sense, it's not different from how I would try and explain it to a corporate who says, what's the point of being in the body when you're working? And there's something about presence. And when we're thinking about coaching, there's something about holding the space, which we talk a lot for coaches about doing. Talk about not being rattled by something a coachee brings to the coaching conversation. So there's a whole piece around, the coach's awareness of their own body that's really important for them to be intelligent about, but also beginning to think about, and even the ICF core competencies speak about this, the non-verbal cues that a client is giving. So the client might be saying something and we notice something different in their body, or their body changes when they talk about a situation that's different from how they were talking about something else. So we need to have an intelligence for that. And I think although Henley is an academic coaching program and it isn't Newfield or Strozzi that lead with the somatic piece,
Yeah, yeah,
as you know, the body is everywhere. So that's not a
yeah.
difficult conversation for me to have. And I think part of the reason I say that is that, you know, it points to something that you and I have often talked about. If we want to work with the body in coaching, we have to do our own somatic work. So I've got years of doing somatic practice and working with the body. So I feel very comfortable taking this
Yeah, yeah.
conversation into those places. Someone who is less experienced might find that more challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't want to reinforce that. So if you're comfortable yourself, it's just not weird when you bring it to other
Yeah,
people. It's
absolutely.
this is
You
home
know,
base for me.
yeah. And when
Yeah.
coaches say to me, "Oh, how do I work with the body with a senior corporate?" I'm like, the more comfortable you are in your own body, the more you have the space to bring it in, like in an embodied way, rather than just a weird idea that you're kind of still feeling your way into yourself.
Yeah, I've found it increasingly easy in some ways. And it's partly my own kind of ease and experience, but it's also the world changing. In the Henley, for example, been very open, very warm, very well received there.
Yeah.
I remember it's been easier than say when I did something for Ashridge like 10 years ago, which was fairly new, or when there were people, colleagues of ours were bringing it to Roffe years ago, or when I was doing much more business work 15 years ago. My sense is it's gotten easier in that the world's got more open-minded.
Well, I think I would say, I mean, I don't know Henley from 10 years ago, so I don't know what's changed in the last 10 years. I mean, I've been there for 6 years now, and I would say partly this is the influence of people like us raising this awareness in coaching. Somatic coaching 10 years ago wasn't as big a thing as it is today. So I think it's partly the coaching world has got more open-minded. I also think, and this might be a comment about our times, that in a world that's more and more chaotic and we're being more and more spun away from our center by world news and distractions and upsets and social media, etc., there's one place that's true, which is
It's
our
an
body.
anchor. It's an anchor for
It's an
people, isn't it,
anchor.
in that kind of
And,
time of chaos.
when I talk to people, even if they've got no awareness of somatics or coaching, they'll say, I'm finding I'm spending more time in nature because it helps me, or I'm spending more time at the pool because it helps me. So I think there is an awareness of we just can't carry on spinning out, following social media and clicking everything that pops into our attention because we really get unanchored.
Yeah, people get that everyone's stressed, but this mixture of exhausted and wired. People get
Yeah,
that
yeah,
technology disembodies us, even if they don't have that word for it. They'll talk about
yeah,
doom
yeah,
scrolling or something
yeah,
like that,
yeah.
right? people get that there are conditions of VUCA in business. So it's sort of not a hard sell, as it were, at this point, despite the fact it's sort of bad in a way for the world. It's definitely got easier, I would say, for us.
Well, I think it's not a hard sell, but I know from my own experience, I've been working in this space at least 15 years because that's how long I've known you, and I did some
Yeah,
work
15
before
years. Yeah.
that. So
Yeah.
it's a long time, and I really understand the importance of this. And I have to work really hard sometimes not to reach my phone when I'm anxious.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Still,
think
still.
it's a discipline. And, one of the things I decided this year, because I knew that this year was going to be challenging for me on a number of levels, was to practice being here more. So I now don't look at my phone until I've meditated, fed my cats and myself. So there's a sense in which the most important things for me to start the day are coming back into my own body, spending time connecting. And, my cats come into my bed first in the morning and they'll purr for like 10 minutes or so. And, I'm not looking at my phone like I used to when I'm there. And at the end of the day, I'll go to the gym and have a
Mm,
swim,
mm.
or I'll watch a quiet movie on the TV, which again is a softening practice. So I think there's something about it's not rocket science, but it takes attention. And I'm lucky that I have a life that allows me to put in a lot of self-care.
Yeah, nice, nice. And self-care is almost a part-time job given the culture we're in.
It
I
is.
think it's like
It
20
really
hours
is.
a week to do the sort of
Yeah,
nature
yeah,
connection, the meditation, the
yeah, yeah,
movement, the
yeah,
embodiment, the
yeah,
dance, the
yeah.
yoga, bit of therapy maybe. Let's stay with business coaching for a bit longer. So
Hmm,
while things may have got a little easier, it's still possible to make mistakes. And I do hear back from students who have gone too hard too soon. They haven't calibrated with business groups, for
hmm.
example, or more mainstream kind of coaching organizations. What do you think are some of the mistakes, like the somatic folks listening to this, rather than the coaches, can make when they work with more mainstream groups?
Hmm. I mean, first of all, I think it's a calibration, and you might have taught me this, or we might have picked it up from Strozzi. How much is too much? How little is too little? So I
Yeah.
think we've always got to have that question in our minds of, how far do I push? And John Whitmore used to say, I try to push people no further than 10% of where they are because too much more than that and they'll close down. So I think it's a live thing. I would say almost it's not really a mistake. It's more because I know when I go too far, it's when I'm not connected to my ground and I'm unanchored myself. And then I get
Right.
carried away. I've got ADHD. So that always makes me kind of jumpy and blurty anyway. And
Yeah,
when I
yeah.
have too much coffee, like yesterday, I made the mistake of having 2 cups of coffee in the morning. And I was turning up at work meetings and I was a bit strung out. And then something happened in the afternoon that I was anxious about and I was jumping in too quickly. So I think there's something for me about it starts with being really intelligent about where my body is.
Right. It all follows the biology. We'll come
Well,
back
I
to
think
ADHD.
it does. And if I'm grounded and I've got my feet on the ground, I can read a room better than I've got a great idea that or a great coaching question that I want to jump in and ask. And I've had too much coffee that morning and I haven't meditated. All of those things are going to make it harder for me to read that the client might not be ready.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And just to credit, yeah, Strozzi, what's too much, what's too little, another great in this field. Wendy Palmer had a version of that, and Paul Linden, my own primary
Oh,
teacher,
yeah.
talked
Yeah.
about calibration. He'd always
Yeah.
talk about the importance
Yeah.
of calibration. And calibration in business for me means not using too hippie words, not pushing too hard, not too much touch. There's multiple levels of calibration from word
Mm,
choice
mm.
to dress
Yeah.
sense to what exercises we're doing, how much of the exercises we do. There's a number of
Yeah.
levels of calibration, I would
Yeah.
say, in a more
And if
mainstream
we think about
context.
the coaching core competencies, this is all about coaching presence. It's about being
Mhm,
tuned
mhm.
in. Some clients can take hard pushes,
Yes, yes.
some can't, or some can't now.
Yeah, my students are always amazed when they see me coach different people differently. And
Yeah,
some of them I'm really tough with and others I'm really tender with. And they're like, but that's different. I'm like, yeah, you have to have range to fit
yeah,
different
yeah,
clients. That's the
yeah.
embodied
We do.
range, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, nice. Okay, what technique wise, what do you think in terms of mainstream coaching, business coaching, technique wise, what do you find is most effective? Like centering, what's helpful for you?
For me, before to get ready or with the client.
Let's do both. Let's do both. So, as a coach, for yourself, and explicitly with a client.
Yeah. So I think for me, it's about making sure that I am centered and I can't always do this because sometimes I've got other things going on. I try not to look at emails in the last few minutes because, partly because
Yeah.
of my brain. When I got an email, it's running through my head and it takes time for
Right.
me to settle and be present. So there's something about checking core of the shape that I'm in. when I'm coaching, particularly when I'm coaching. I mean, I try to do that in life because I think that's good practice, but particularly when I'm coaching. And with my clients, I notice, particularly now, because I do most of my coaching on Zoom, my clients will arrive in a rush from one previous meeting, and this
Right.
meeting they're squeezing in. So I will sometimes explicitly say, let's take a moment to arrive together and maybe let go of what's happening. And in fact, because I teach at Henley, one of the things that happens is we do a lot of student demos. And there was one student who was just lovely because even when he was the coachee in the practices, he would say to the coach, let's take a few minutes to breathe together. And, I think there is something about giving people space to arrive.
Yeah, there's two pieces there, isn't there? One is just helping them regulate, so adding some self-regulation to the co-regulation for their landing,
Mm,
as it were. And the
mm.
second piece there is a synchronization, the
Yeah,
entrainment of breathing together. There's sort of
yeah,
two
yeah,
pieces you
yeah, yeah,
mentioned, and I,
yeah.
I pretty much do centering with nearly every client every time. It's
Mm.
like Curtis Watkins, the late great, our
Yeah,
shared colleague. He
that's
always
his
be like,
part.
3 deep breaths, Mark. When he coached me, he'd always say 3 deep breaths. Something
Yeah,
it can be that simple. It doesn't
yeah,
have to
yeah,
be
yeah.
super advanced. Yeah.
Yeah. And also the other thing I'm noticing, and this is maybe why when you said earlier that the work is getting easier, I think people are more, what's the word? They're more appreciative and in need of coming back to themselves because they're so spun out. Most people who work in organizations in particular are in many conversations, many commitments, some of which are conflicting. Then they're trying to manage that with their lives and they're dealing with what's going on in the world and trying to take leadership, etc. So there's something for me that I increasingly say this very publicly now. Coaching is a spiritual vocation, and we can interpret that in many ways. But one of the ways in which I think it is a spiritual vocation is it's a space for people to come back to themselves when they've been spun out all life. You know,
Place for people to come back to themselves when
Yeah,
they've
and
been.
most of us don't have that. I keep. I'm not properly Jewish, but I do keep a loose Shabbat. And part of the practice of Shabbat for me is a day of switching off from tweaking the world and changing this and deciding that and buying this, coming back to myself.
So Shabbat is day of rest, right?
It's a
Like,
day of rest, absolutely, in the Jewish tradition. It's Friday night to Saturday evening. And, I think we need practices like that. I mean, that's why I meditate every morning. It's a mini Shabbat. Watching an old Japanese movie that doesn't really have any plot, but it's very slow, is like a mini Shabbat at the end of the day. And I find my clients are really in need of that.
it's interesting. I used to sort of, when I started working in business, when I met you like 15, 20 years ago, saying, oh, we're not doing anything spiritual because that used to scare them off.
Yeah.
But now I'm thinking you can certainly talk about meaning, right?
Yeah.
And I think you can talk about spirituality as long as you say, and here's what I mean by that. It
Well,
means
sometimes
X,
we don't
Y.
even need to say that, because there's a whole thing about spiritual intelligence now that people are talking about in the
Yep,
way that we're
yep,
talking about
yep.
emotional intelligence. I think, there's a lot of talk about mental health and well-being in the workplace that there wasn't there 10 or 15 years ago. So I think there's more awareness of it. I mean, there's counter forces to that, obviously, and we're seeing some of that in the, what's happened in the last few months with diversity and inclusion policies and, mental health issues being closed down in some places. But broadly speaking, the corporate world has become a lot more aware of the importance of these things.
Mm. You still doing yoga personally? I know you had a strong Iyengar practice.
I mean, it's funny because I know you used to tease me about that in the old days, but I don't do it as much as I did. I'm doing other somatic practices. I swim much more. I'm doing
Okay.
weights much more. So, I do somatic practice. I still do yoga and I still notice I've got the flexibility that lots of people my age don't have because of all the yoga that I've done. And I still do yoga stretches, but I used to do 4 or 5 Iyengar classes a week. And then the
Wow.
pandemic happened, and lots of things changed to me during the pandemic. And now I might do one a class a week or go on a yoga retreat once a year, but mostly it's weight training, swimming, walking.
Well, I love weight training. It's accessible and it can be a physical practice, but you can turn it into a somatic practice as well, right? Like bringing more mindfulness to it. And
Well, you can do that, but also I think there's something I've been thinking about. And I was thinking about this before our conversation.
yeah.
One of the things that I think we have to do in this world is take space
Okay. Say more.
and create space for ourselves. We sometimes have to have difficult conversations with people. You know, we have to stand for things that we care about, particularly at the moment. As you know, I'm quite passionate about diversity and inclusion. That's getting a lot of flack at the moment. And I think we have to stand for something. And that means being able to be strong in our feet, take a stand for what we believe in, and respond to the world rather than just rolling over like Mark Zuckerberg does and goes, oh, I'll just give it all up. I go, no, I care about this, and sometimes that might make me unpopular. But if we think about business leaders, they have to
Yes.
make decisions that make them unpopular. They have to communicate things that are difficult. If they are connected to their ground and their bodies, and I think weights and physical working out, they build a stronger sense of the definition of the self that I am, help us to hold our ground when there's pressure to be nice or comply or give up something we care about. So I think it's a really important place to come from.
Yeah, weights can really give us that sense of oomph and spine. Obviously, I'm a stand against DEI, but
I know you
hopefully,
are. But
but
we're not going to have that conversation now because that's not what I
listen,
want to talk
you're
about.
a
It's really
strong
to
black
talk
woman.
about
You
the issue
you
of
benefit
taking a
from it.
stand for what we believe in.
Exactly. And I think the other thing is that even if we believe different things, can we stay empathic and in relationship and connection? I think that's really important, whatever side of different fences we're on.
Yeah, I think that's true. And, one of the things that I think about this is, I can have really strong opinions, and there are some things I don't have any respect for, but I can have respect for the individual saying it. And I think that's also important that I have ground to be able to hold that.
Mm, nice. Let's go back to ADHD. So we were into ADHD before it was cool. Hashtag early adopters. It's now incredibly sort of widespread diagnosis
Hmm.
or neuroatypicality more generally.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's talk about ADHD and coaching. So, as a
Yeah.
coach, how does ADHD impact you, and how do we coach people with ADHD?
Well, I think partly, it affects me in lots of ways. I've always found it hard to pay attention, and I didn't know I was ADHD till last year, and I was also diagnosed as autistic. So this is new for me still. I mean, I've integrated some of it. I think it's recognizing the coach that I am and contracting for that. And I remember years ago, like 25 years ago, there was quite a famous coach in the US, and he told me that all coaching that wasn't done in person was done over the phone in those days. We didn't have the internet, or we almost didn't have the internet when I started. And
Damn you old, Aboodi. Damn you old.
I am. I was coaching in the last century when I had hair. So, but he said he would play solitaire on his computer when he coached. And I thought, oh my God, that's terrible. How does he give it, And now I go, he's probably, I don't know him, I haven't been in touch with him for years. Maybe he has a, neurodivergence going on. And that was his way for keeping his brain quiet. And I interviewed a coach recently and she had a fidget toy while she was coaching me. And so I think part of this is the more aware we are of it, the more we might contract and say, I need to look away sometimes, or I fidget and I have a fidget toy. So I think that's part of it. I think there's also something in it. I was just leading a reflective group with some Henley students just now, and they were saying, the client who doesn't do what they say they will do. Maybe ADHD is at play. So there's something about
Uh,
beginning to get
uh,
curious about why might the person in front of us be showing up the way that they do. I think this goes beyond ADHD. I think this is also part of the wider, being aware of cultural differences in terms of, some people maintain eye contact, some don't, etc. So I think it's really about developing our sensitivity to there's no right way to be a coach and there's no right way to be a coachee. And just because a client looks away and fidgets doesn't mean they're not engaged. It might be that they're neurodivergent.
let's stay with ADHD for a little moment.
Yeah.
So, some of it, as you say, is kind of like contracting, right? Like whether it's as a coach or a coachee,
Mm, mm.
like, or for me as a manager, sometimes I'm like, hey guys, I tend to forget things,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
like
yeah.
this is like my German course manager for our coaching course sat me down today with the finances. The meeting took 30 minutes, so not an hour. And she laid it out for me like on a really clear
Mm, mm.
document. And it was like color. She's like, this is what we spend on this,
Yeah,
this is what
yeah,
we spend on
yeah,
that. And I was like, Alina, thank you so much. And she's
yeah,
like, Mark, I know how to work with you. I've worked with
yeah,
you for three
yeah,
years.
yeah,
So it's
yeah,
like that's like a colleague who understands that for me,
yeah.
that's how I need things.
And one of the things that I sit on the Equity and Diversity Committee at Henley, and one of the things we've just done is create a template for how to run meetings in a way that's neuro-inclusive
Neuro inclusive. So
or inclusive of neurodivergence. I mean,
the main ones. So let's talk about the main types. So this sort of dyslexia, I guess it's one end of the spectrum, and then we've got autism and ADHD, right? These are the main
they're the main ones. We've also
neurodivergences.
got
Is that right?
dyspraxia. I mean, it's a big field, and I don't claim to know all about it. It's an emerging field that I'm still learning about. But there's something about how do we make meetings more concise? For instance, how do we keep to task? Because that's easier for some people to stick to. And then one of the things I found out, because I went to the HR department when I got my diagnosis, and we're talking about what the university is doing to support people with neurodivergence. And one of the things they had was a piece of guidance for how to work with autistic people. And it said, don't ask autistic people open questions. They prefer closed questions. It's not always true
Like
because not,
yes or no questions or
yeah,
like
because not all autistic people are the same. But what it made me think about is in coaching, we
okay.
always ask open questions. But maybe if we have an autistic coachee, they might respond better to closed questions. So I think one of the things this is doing is making us question even some of the assumptions of the coaching core competencies.
Right, because I mean, they do come from although they all strike me as being very American, very liberal in many ways, because a lot of early coaches were from that cultural background.
Yeah, absolutely. All of the early coaches, pretty much, or the people who are responsible for setting up the professional bodies and the schools, mostly came out of the US, and most of them came out of the work of Landmark and Werner Erhard.
Right, so there was a certain kind of cultural bias in there. I mean, it does seem like there's an increasing diagnosis, and some of those are people who would have been missed before. Like my niece was diagnosed young, I wasn't diagnosed
Me
at
too.
school, which is like,
Yeah,
how did that
yeah. I
happen?
was a
Now it is
difficult,
no way.
problematic child who fidgeted all the time and got
Right.
told off, and I was too much and everything else. So some of it, you're right, is not being picked up earlier. For
And
most of us, that's true if we're
is
late
there
diagnosed.
now it seems like almost half the young people I speak to are neurodivergent, in which case the term loses its meaning. And it's to me, it also seems like a couple of factors. One is there's some victim points you get from it, right? There are some advantages you get from a diagnosis as well as disadvantages. Second point is the culture's sending everybody ADHD. I feel like everyone else's brain has been destroyed by technology and is caught up with my traumatized ADHD brain. So it's like anyone that had trauma and ADHD as a child now seems like most people just using a mobile phone. So
Yeah,
there's a
I mean,
couple of
I
factors
think
there.
I don't know enough about it to make comments of one way or the other about, is it being misdiagnosed? Are people using it as victim status? But I do recognize that our culture, with its always on, the phones demanding our attention all of the time, is problematic and is going to make us more distractible. And if we've got that tendency already, of course, it's going to be exaggerated. But most people I know struggle with keeping away from their phones and technology,
How much
neurotypical or not.
how much do we have to slow down to accommodate the normies of Booty? People are always telling me to slow down. We even have a special hand signal in my coaching course to
Yeah, me
for people
too.
to help me to slow down.
I once was in Russia speaking at a conference, and the guy said to me afterwards, "You spoke so fast we couldn't translate you because there are like Russian sentences
It's
are
longer
about twice as
words.
long, longer
Yeah,
words, etc."
yeah.
So I'm the same, and I have to. I think there's a question about again, it's a calibration piece. So part of the work I do around diversity and inclusion is that the person experiencing diversity shouldn't be the one having to explain to other
Really? Because I
well,
don't mind
hang on, I haven't
explaining
finished,
my
Mark. Let me
ADHD.
finish. Let me finish. Because what I was going to say is that's where I used to be. But,
Yeah.
I would love people to be quiet on buses and not have their phones pinging all the
Yes, my God, yes.
But the easiest way for me to deal with that is I bought a nice pair of noise cancelling headphones. And when it gets too
Right.
problematic, I put the headphones on and I put white noise in and I can have a serene bus journey.
White noise is racist, just so you know.
I'm not going to take the bait, Mark. So there's something for me about it's a calibration. Of course, I want people to be more sensitive to different perspectives and different needs. That's what you'd expect me to say.
Yeah.
I'm very
Yeah.
strongly committed to diversity and inclusion. But I also recognize there might be things that I can do to make my life easier. And I shouldn't close my eyes to them and just go, well, everyone should be quiet on the bus. That doesn't mean that people shouldn't be thinking about the language they use and, being careful not to use racially offensive terms or be sensitive to where people are coming from. I really believe that. And I know we disagree about that. But I do think there's a calibration around this piece. And I don't know where the line lies.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. And we're not so different on this. And I think there's this nice term from HR, reasonable accommodation.
Yeah.
And there needs to be a sort of equivalent, which is like reasonable explanation, right? Like I need to reasonably explain to my German team how I, have this ADHD, and they need to reasonably accommodate me. And then we meet in the middle and
Yeah,
everybody's happy.
absolutely. And that's what's happened for me at Henley. Once I got my diagnosis, I've been talking to my team and my colleagues, and we are making reasonable adjustments. And I'm getting more aware of I'm really high maintenance, actually. I
Yeah, well,
am.
we're not the easiest.
But
We're
what
not
I
the
mean by
easiest.
that is I need a lot of care and I get very anxious about certain kinds of things. And if I know that, like I had an issue yesterday, I was very anxious and I spoke to our admin team and I owned it by saying, I am just really over anxious about this. So there is something about reasonable explanation. And when we know what we need, we might be able to communicate it. That is a two-way process, though, because there are lots of
Right.
people I know with ADHD or autism who try and explain what they need and they get closed down.
Right. So there's this sort of responsibility on one side to educate oneself about oneself and to explain that clearly. Responsibility on the other side to have some education of difference. Like I know a little bit about Jewish culture, for example, right? Like I've learned about it, right? It's like that's a good thing. And, some of the traumas my Jewish friends and colleagues have. And there's also a sort of responsibility on both sides, I'd say there, right? So that to me feels more
I
reasonable than
think that's
demanding it.
fair. And I also think that one of the things that I'm really aware of, particularly in the race and gender space, is that there's been too much emphasis on the person suffering the discrimination to do the explanations and not enough around the other side doing the education. So I think it probably would be good if it's equally split, but it's for so long hasn't been equally split.
Yeah, I think it's swung the other way in some environments,
Well,
but
let's
that's
not go
pretty
there
environmental.
because that's all the
I mean, we're
conversation.
having a reasonable conversation.
Well,
I
we
don't.
are, but I suppose I don't want to make this about diversity, partly because we
Yeah.
disagree, but partly because
Well,
it's got not very much to do with somatics.
okay, so ADHD, we've looked at that. Let's go back to the somatic side of coaching then.
Hmm.
I want to do I just want to do another round on this. If there's a coach listening to this saying, "Hey, I'm a coach. I've got some good techniques. I don't need to work with the body." What would you say?
Well, I'd probably say why.
Like, why do you just be curious? Like, what's
Well,
less?
it's like, well, it'd be a bit more than curious, Mark. It would be a bit indignant. Like, why do you think you wouldn't want to work with the most important bit? I mean, you used to say, and I sometimes quote it, that the body isn't just a taxi for the brain.
Yeah, that was from Frankie Byers, my colleague originally, I
And
think.
we live in a culture that privileges the brain. We're
Right,
smart,
right.
intellectual, rational beings, and yet the body is the thing that does everything, and everything is lived through the body. As you mentioned, our lovely late friend Curtis, it's all about the body. So the idea that we would exclude this thing that we live and inhabit from coaching, it's just kind of weird to me now.
It's kind of odd, right? It's like, why would you exclude this? I mean, A, it's just a part of being human. But B, as a coach, it's often the bit the coachee hasn't looked at. So I'm like, this is where you're going to get the leverage because I work with clever people who've
Yeah,
had a
and
lot
not,
of
not
thinking already.
Not only have they not looked at it, but their bodies, again, I don't know who it was who said it, the body never lies. So they might have a good story to tell, but if they show up in a way that, they've got less control over their bodies. The body reveals much more than our words. So
Right.
it's
So it gives
really,
information to the coach and the coachee.
yeah, absolutely.
I think there's another piece, which is that if you don't work with the body, it will undermine what you're doing linguistically.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. But when I started coaching, Mark, we used to say, I didn't say, but the coaching profession used to say, there's no place for emotions in coaching.
Wow,
Emotions
people
are
said that.
broken. Yeah,
People
yeah,
said that.
absolutely. I wrote a chapter.
That's
So
some stiff upper lip bullshit, man. People really said
I
that.
wrote a chapter on emotions
Wow.
in coaching, and I had to do some research in it. And there was stuff where people said there's no place for emotions in coaching. That's the purview of therapy. Remember the coaching profession at one stage wanted to distance itself very far from therapy. And how can you work with a human being who's working in an organization and not pay attention to the emotions? So I think it's like coaching at the beginning was caught up in this whole hyper rationalistic perspective that said there's no place for emotions, there's no place for the body. It's mind over matter. If you think you can do it, you can do it.
I mean, it's
And
Western culture just generally expressing itself as
yeah,
well.
it's part of our culture. So we're having to do something that's a little bit different. Even, you know this because we talked about this. James Joyce in his short story, which he wrote like 100 years ago, Mr. Duffy lived at a little distance away from
Yes.
his body. And that was before mobile phones came along.
Coaching versus therapy. So a lot of my students will have this fear that they'll say like, I hope this isn't therapy. I'm not doing therapy. When does it become therapy? It's like therapy is carved out all of the human emotional side. So what would you say? What is the line between therapy and coaching? And is that a line we can cross or not?
Well, I think it depends on the individual coach. I'm very comfortable working very deeply with clients. And when I've done demos where clients have become very emotional and I've stayed with it and worked with it, sometimes observers will say, that looks like therapy to me. So I think it's a continuum, and I think we all have to find our own place in it. There's a couple of thoughts that come to mind. One is that John Whitmore used to say this. If you start crying, Mark, and I hand you a tissue and say, don't cry, or try and move you away from your sadness, I've got to work on my own sadness so I can hold you with yours. So there's inner work we have to do to build our range, as you were saying earlier. But the other thing I think about, and it's gone from my brain for a moment, just give me a second. Oh yeah, one distinction that I make between in terms of working with emotions and pain is if it's a point of learning, like I learn to fear the world and I've done some work with that, I can then look at new practices to practice boldness with the world. If there's still trauma that's holding me back, that I can't just develop new practices, I might have to go and do emotional work in therapy or trauma therapy or whatever it is. The
Mm,
two can happen together. But if it's healing, then I think it's therapeutic. If it's learning, and this fits a bit with the ontological model that you and I are steeped in,
right, right.
then yes, I can learn to practice being joyful or I can practice being light. But if I'm still in the trauma of it and I got to heal it, I might have to do that work first.
Yeah, it's important work. Like we both do trauma therapy or have done, so
Yeah,
it's not,
yeah, yeah.
addiction work, whatever. So a few distinctions. One would be, often coaching is more forwards focus rather than past focus. I'm not often going through people's pain stories with people. Very rarely. If there's emotion in the present moment, I'm totally happy to work with that. But I'm not like saying, tell me about your childhood, right? That's just not part of.
Well, sometimes I will.
Really? I rarely.
Because my childhood, our
Yeah.
childhood, shapes the human being that's here today. And if I grew up, for instance, with a violent father and I had to keep quiet and hide from him and keep myself low to not be seen, it
Yeah,
might be
yeah.
that I don't show up and speak up at meetings.
Right, but that's historical. So Curtis would always say to me, like, hey, this pattern comes from the past. It was useful then. It's not working now. So what are we going to do to learn something new? Like
So
that's the basic equation, right?
that's the coaching response, but the
Yeah.
therapeutic response might be there's still work that needs to be done before you can do something about it. And that's partly what I
Uh-huh.
mean
Uh-huh.
about this distinction in healing and learning. I absolutely agree with
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah. So
But
let's
of course,
let's
if someone shows up and says to me, I don't like to speak up at meetings, and and I say, where did that come from? And they say, well, my father used to beat me, so I keep like, probably like, have you done work with that? No, I
right. You
haven't.
can validate
You
it, you can
might need to go back
empathize.
and do work with that. But it
Yeah.
makes sense that you don't speak up meetings if you had a father that beat you every
Sure.
time you spoke.
I'm not saying
So
we're
there's a
full players.
learning piece to that, which I think this distinction that coaching tries to bring about, it's all future focused and nothing to do with the past, I think is a mistake.
I mean, I
And
can
again, the body
acknowledge the
keeps the
past, but
score, as
I just
Bessel
go,
van der
that's not
Kolk
my
says.
work. Yeah, I think it's okay to say, hey, we can acknowledge that we're formed by our past and shaped literally and figuratively in that way. Yeah, yeah. Good. Okay, so let's talk ethics now. So how
Yeah.
does the body tie into like, business coaching ethics? For example, I've had clients that would become very emotional and they weren't used to it because they're in a more sort of emotionless business world or supposedly. Or there's like, okay, is there too much touch? What does that involve ethically? Or is it ethical to get people in their bodies where there might be pain and trauma there? What are some of the ethics that relate specifically to embodied business coaching?
Well, I think I don't know that there are specific ethics, and I haven't got the code of ethics verbatim in my mind at the moment, but I think there's something here about taking care of the coachee in their context. So, I mean, I would never touch my clients. I don't work in
Oh,
that
yeah,
way.
almost never the same. Same.
You know, um, I do encourage people to get into their bodies, and sometimes they become emotional. But usually, I'm working from them and they're on Zoom, and I will say, "Let's take care of you as we go about this," and I will make it my responsibility to hold the space for them to do their work safely and check in with them about how they're going. And if it's too much, we'll stop. So I think there's
Okay.
something for me about the principle here being one of care for our clients. And it goes
Care
back
and
to what I said
calibration again,
earlier.
right?
It's calibration, and because I know you quite well, you're much more robust maybe because you've done a lot of work on yourself than someone who's never done somatic work before.
And I think that's worth, particularly like embodiment practitioners listening to this, to understand that for someone fairly new to embodied work, it can be really opening up a lot. So the calibration
Mm.
might be much lighter than
Yeah,
someone who's done a lot of
exactly.
body work or who has great self-regulation from their yoga practice or whatever.
Yeah.
So that's one principle. As you said, the other one is the context they're in, right? Like if I'm doing a training for a group of business people, I'm aware that they have to work together the next day. If it's a
Yeah.
group leadership
Yeah.
session, for example,
Mhm.
or if they're coaching, they might have to do a sales pitch immediately after the call. So
Yeah.
it's my job to make sure they're put back together emotionally at the end of the session.
Absolutely. So this is part of the containment of the coaching conversation. We might be doing deep work. What do you need to leave? And if I sense the work has been deep, I might just allow extra time for that so they
Yeah.
can go
Yeah.
back and do what they have to do because we've all got to go back into our lives.
Right, right. We call this the U curve of coaching. There has to be a way out as well as you can't
Yeah,
just do depth, 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 and then end the session. That's not fair.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
not kind or fair. And I just also want to underline in red what you said there, because people sometimes think embodied coaching means a lot of touch, like massage or something. But you work on Zoom. I work 90% over the phone. I mean, people can see on YouTube some examples of sort of low level appropriate touch, like shoulders, arms, and things. But generally we're working completely without touch, right?
Hmm.
Like that's actually surprising to people when they hear there's such a thing. That's a fear for people that I can't do embodied coaching, business coaching, because it means that it's going to be very touchy feely. And it's like, no, 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 no one's touching anyone here.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I don't have that sense that of somatic coaching as being anything like that. And I'm used to. I mean, when I had trauma therapy, I started trauma therapy in Zoom, in
Right,
Zoom
right.
land because it was during the pandemic, and I didn't think it could work,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and it was
Yeah.
brilliant.
No, I've had some great therapy virtually as well. I mean, sometimes it's good to get body work too, but that's a. What if
And I
somebody else?
think.
Go
Sorry,
on,
go on.
after you.
No, you go because I forgot what I was going to say.
Okay, so what are some of the other misunderstandings around when you say, "Hey, I do somatic coaching or embodied coaching"? One I get is it very touchy? Another one is, "Hey, this is yoga. Are you going to talk about chakras?" No, I'm not. What are some of the misunderstandings you still bump into or
Well,
preconceptions?
actually, I don't get any of those. I mean, maybe we mix with different people because I
Okay.
don't get those kind of reactions. I do sometimes get. It's not even really a pushback, but it's curious to what might this have to do with leadership?
Right, right. So what would be your response there?
So I would say, how you show up. We don't follow a leader because of what's on her CV. We follow a leader because how she shows up, the impact she makes when she's in the room with you.
You made a mistake there, but you said her.
I'm not going down there, Mark.
Come on, I'm just friendly trolling you at this point.
Yeah, well,
I've had many
we're
female
not here to
coaches.
troll each other, are we?
I am. I enjoy it.
All
Uh,
right.
maybe the last thing. So, pandemic. A lot of yoga teachers out there have told me that the classes didn't have never been the same since the pandemic. I've noticed with coaching students, there's a fragility that's maybe been going on for the last few hundred years, but it seems to have got a bit worse since the pandemic. What's your sense now we're a few years the other side of the pandemic? How is there any lasting impact, you think?
Yeah, I think there is, well, I think partly, I sometimes go to yoga classes on Zoom because it's easier. And my teacher teaches a class that's on Zoom that I can get to, and she makes really good observations of my body because she's been training herself to look at cameras, and so sometimes she can see more than she could before.
Wow. Wow.
So I think, and we moved our entire coaching program overnight onto Zoom, as most coaching schools did, and students,
Yes,
oh, it can't possibly work, and it did.
it
So
did. Yeah, our course works.
but
Yeah,
of course,
works.
things have changed, and we've got much more used to doing stuff online than we did before. I think, I don't know about people being more fragile. I think what it does is it makes people a little bit less embodied when we're doing coaching over Zoom, even though they can move about. One of the things I did before the pandemic, and I haven't really got back into the habit of this, was taking people and we go out for walks in the park or something like that. So there was much more movement in the being of coaching. And when we're sat in
Mm.
front of our computer, it's almost like I'm talking to you now, Mark. We're having our conversation. Then I'll meet my client. Then I'll do this, and it's all me sat in front of my computer. There's no somatic change. I'm
Right.
sat in
Yeah. I
my
mean,
chair and I move
I
from
do a
one
lot of
position
phone
to another.
coaching because I like my clients to move, and I say get up and
Yeah,
go for a
yeah,
walk. Walk in the
yeah.
park. Most
That's
people
a
have a
good
quiet
idea,
space.
actually.
It just
That's a
gets
good
people
idea.
away from. It
Yeah,
gets them moving their bodies, and
yeah,
I
yeah.
say, listen, we're trying to move your mind. We're trying to give you fresh ideas to solve your problems. So let's move your body as a way to move your mind. Like that's basic.
Mm.
Also means I get my 15K steps in every day, Aboodi, which is it's a great
It's
way to
all
lose.
about you.
For all it's definitely for me, I'm not going to do any coaching which harms my well-being, and that
Mm,
includes spending 3 hours a day staring at Zoom. So, like for
mm.
me, that's a commitment to my own health as well as
Yeah,
to the
yeah.
client. Yeah. This has been great. I think this is going to be so practical for any coach who's interested in working with the body. I think we've hit a few really useful topics.
Right.
Before we wrap up, is there anything you feel like, yeah, we should definitely let the coaches know? Imagine like a sort of business coach, someone kind of fairly straight-laced listening to this. What any kind of closing thoughts for them?
Well, I suppose I would just say, and it's sort of recapping a little bit of what I touched on earlier, Mark, is if you want to work with people at a deeper level, you're going to have to include the body. And if you want to include the body, you're going to have to get to know your own body and build range. And that's going to mean putting yourselves into practices that are not your normal practices. If you're someone who's very still, you might need to move around a lot. If you move around a lot, you might need to be still. Just to use a very simple
Yeah.
polarity. Build range.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would just add to that, like awareness, range, and choice. Bring awareness of what you're doing.
Yeah,
Build range so you've got more choices, then you can work more skillfully with more different types of client, which you can make more money. That's the sort of business case for that as well, I would say, right? Like
yeah,
you can work
yeah.
with more people. So yeah, that's a basic. And having your own practice as a coach, like it's certainly I said in my it's a like embodied like business coach, it's like, hey, you don't have to become a yoga teacher or a conscious dance hippie, but you need a little bit of somatic practice in your own
Yeah,
life.
we've got to do our own practice.
Yeah. Yeah. Boom, a booty. I think we've, with our ADHD minds here, we've crammed a lot in for people. So maybe let's wrap up. I feel like we're
Yeah.
ending well. Where do people find you? Where do people go to find out more?
Well, I work for Henley, so you can go to Henley's website. But I've also just, it hasn't been launched yet because I'm just doing all the domain transfers. But I'm launching a new site for coaches called coachingtothesoul.com.
Oh, nice. Coachingtothesoul.com.
Yeah, which will be live in about 2 weeks. So maybe by the
That
time the
yeah, it'll be
podcast
live
is edited.
by the time this is out, it'll be live. So coaching to soul, and shout out to Henley. I've found them very professional, very competent, very friendly when I've worked with them. So yeah, I want to give them some love.
Yeah, give a big shout to Henley. They pay my wages some of the
Shout out
time.
to
So.
Henley, Henley Massive. Okay, so let's leave it there. Aboodi, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Mark.